Senator James Lankford doing another conversation about on Facebook Live about what's happening in impeachment much earlier than I have on the previous times, because we actually finished up this session at around a little before 3 o'clock on Eastern time. So it barely went 2 hours total today, which is similar to what happened on Saturday, a shorter time as well. This was the third day, last day for the White House counsel to be able to make its case. They had three speakers that came out today, and as they walked through the process, they first started with constitutional arguments and some of the recap from some of the constitutional arguments from the day before, and then added in some additional conversations just about things being vague in an impeachment, what that would mean, what that was like, what the founders commented about impeachment, and walked through some of those issues. And then they switched over to what they called the other accusations, things that were stated in the the House manager's argument, but were not really in the articles of impeachment. And they went through several things. One was that the White House tried to cover up the record on the call by putting it in a super secret server and separate it out from everyone so no one could get access to it. Problem was they went through the facts of that and they said, yes, it was in a different kind of server, because actually one of the staff that was there, Tim Morrison, who was one of the witnesses for the House impeachment hearings, actually stated, yes, he's the one that recommended, because he thought this call is going to be twisted out of perspective based on partisan issues in Washington, D.C. And so he just recommended it be put into place and be tagged according to that. Sure enough, it was twisted out based on partisan basis. They asked Tim Morrison, did he think there was anything inappropriate? And he said, no, I don't think there's anything inappropriate. I just think it's going to be misinterpreted. And so it was interesting to be able to hear that. But they also said the server that was put in, was it really blocked access from anyone? All of the National Security Council still had access to it. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman still had access to it. Everybody that was in the process still had access to it. And so, yes, it was a different server because of Tim Morrison's recommendation on that, not based on somebody else from the White House, but everyone still had access to it. He said, so it's not a cover-up if everyone who needed it still had access to it, just like any other server. They also went through this challenge that the Inspector General, when dealing with a whistleblower complaint, was actually trying to bury the whole thing and was trying to be able to keep it from going public. The House manager spent a lot of time on this argument, saying that this was an urgent matter. The Inspector General saw it as an urgent matter, and it was kept from the public when the law says it has to be released within 14 days. So the White House actually went back to the actual statute, and yes, it does use the word urgent in it, but it also lists in it and says it has to be intelligence related, and it has to be not just somebody from the intelligence agency, but the actual topic of the issue has to be intelligence related. And this is not intelligence related. This is a phone call between two heads of state. So the nonpartisan career staff of the Office of Legal Counsel looked at that and said, this whistleblower complaint doesn't fall within the whistleblower statute based on that, and sent it over to the Department of Justice and says, it's not that it's going to get buried. It needs to go to the right spot. It's in the wrong place. So they sent it over to the Department of Justice. Department of Justice opened it up, looked at it and said, okay, on its face, this looks like this could be a campaign violation issue. So they did their research on it based on that, and then came back and said, no, it's not. And so then they closed the case. And so it actually followed the exact steps that every other whistleblower complaint would go through. There was nothing different about this whistleblower complaint other than the whistleblower made sure that they got it released out in the spot they wanted to get it released eventually. And it did all come out eventually. What's interesting about the whole process with the Inspector General and the whistleblower, the only part that has never been released is the actual testimony with the House in the SCIF with the Inspector General related to the whistleblower and that call and how that actually came down. That's the only part of this whole process that's actually not public now about the Inspector General and that whole process. So he went through that at length and said, no one's trying to hide it. No one's trying to do anything. Here's the exact process. It's handled the same way of everything else. Giuseculo stood up as the second speaker, went through the process of impeachment. What has that been historically, but also did a challenge that actually Manager Schiff had said, you need to walk in someone else's shoes. And so Giuseculo said, okay, so let's set this in context to walk in other people's shoes, because there's been a challenge that the president should have always used official resources, should have trusted all the career staff, that sometimes he differs from career staff and doesn't trust them. And it's been implied over and over again that's an impeachable issue, but clearly they brought up that's actually a policy difference. The president is the one who makes decisions for every executive agency. His staff makes recommendations to him, but ultimately at the end of the day, the president of the United States constitutionally is the one who makes those decisions through it. And so he talked through some of that. He said, but let's talk about the president and the advice from different staff and his trust in this process and what's happened. And he walked through several things. Before the president actually became president, FBI Director Comey sat down with him, read him through the dossier that's now been proved false. That same dossier that the FBI director said was salacious and unfounded, they actually used it then. An FBI attorney working under him used that to then get a FISA warrant, which now the FISA court has come back and said, okay, that was false, and you were misleading us using that document because of the way that you wrote it, and you knew there was false information with it. That same lawyer that gave false information was hired on by the Mueller investigation, was in the start of the Mueller investigation until all of that area was learned. Then Mueller had to fire him. Then you got Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were in the middle of the Mueller investigation, the FBI, and he just kind of walked through all of the things that happened in the first 2.5 years of internal people that were fighting against the president at the very beginning and doing all these investigations. And at the end of the Mueller investigation, the end of it, Mueller's conclusion was there was no conspiracy from candidate Trump or people in his campaign to be able to work with the Russians. And so this call was literally the day after all of that had been resolved. And so it was interesting just to be able to hear him put it all in context and say, get in the president's head. Does he always trust the advice of every staff member, of every person around him, taking care of every issue? No, at times he takes things into his own hands because he is concerned about some of the things that are actually around him. So it was just an interesting conversation to be able to walk through. They actually walked through some of the other fact matters. I'm sorry, I'm looking over my notes and some of the things from today. But he talked about the president knew he wasn't alone on the call. Every head of state, he knows there's a bunch of people that are on the call on both sides of it. He talked about the burden sharing issue that the president identified, and there were two issues the president really wanted to have in Ukraine them to be able to take care of. One is the United States is not the primary group taking care of Ukraine, that other nations are also being engaged on that. The other one is dealing with corruption. Both those topics came up in the call, but when you go to the September 1st meeting, all of the notes, all the prep, and all the report back from the vice president to the president after that September 1 meeting with Zelensky was all about the two issues, burden sharing and about corruption. It was the money was actually released the 11th of September. The High Court for Corruption was actually set up in Ukraine the 5th of September. And they kind of walk through all these different facts that are there. They're just being kind of conveniently left out as they go through the process. So there was a lot of just review on details and some additional details as they walk through this, and some of the passion about aid and what was done and what actually happened. It ended actually with a very short statement from Pat Cipollone, who is the lead counsel for the White House, just kind of walking through to make a decision on this case. You need the Constitution and you need common sense. Those are the two things that you need. You should look at the Constitution. What's the constitutional standard for an impeachment? Does it rise to that standard in any way, or is this just a policy difference that needs to be determined by an election? Differences that we have as Americans are determined by elections. High crimes are actually dealt with by impeachment. It was interesting. He started his presentation by playing a tape of a bunch of different Democrats that are in the House and the Senate, some of them the House managers now, and some of them leadership in the Senate now, that they were in the House of Representatives in 1998 when Bill Clinton was impeached. And he he showed the video of all the statements they were making about partisan impeachments, about following the law, about it has to be a high crime. It can't just be something else. It's got to be a really high crime, all of those things. And then talked about how if you go down this road, it's very divisive to the country. And Pat Cipollone played all those and then turned to the Democrats, all of them that were in the room, and said, you were right then, you're right now. You should have taken the advice of your younger self because all of these things have come true. The nation's very divided. This has been very partisan and very difficult for the country, just like it was in 1999. It is right now. And it ended actually with Chuck Schumer's statement from 1998 saying that he fears that in the future there'll be a Republican president and the Democrats will say, payback, we're going to actually do impeachment to you. And he said, well, we'll see if that's actually what is becoming of us now. So at the end of the day, it ended with a procedural conversation about what happens next. The next 2 days, there'll be questions from any senator. I've been gathering questions that I'm going to submit to those. The questions are in writing. They go to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He then issues those out either to the House managers or to the White House counsel. You can ask a question of both or a question of one or the other. Each side is given 5 minutes to be able to respond to their question. And we'll have 8 hours of questions tomorrow. And then the next day, the same thing all over again, 8 hours of questions until we run out of questions. There's no limit on the number of questions any senator can ask. I am talking to some other senators saying, what questions are you asking? So we're not redundant. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has the ability to say, I've got the same question from 9 different people and combine them all into one. So it's not that every question is going to be redundant over and over and over and over again, saying the same thing. There is a way to be able to put all those things together and be able to ask it one time and say, this is from this group of senators, that they all ask basically the same question, a little bit different way, but they're basically asking the same question. The questions will alternate Republican, Democrat on who actually presented the question. And then it'll just go back and forth until we're done. Like I said, 8 hours tomorrow and then 8 hours the next day. And then it continues to be able to move from there. So still have a long day tomorrow and a lot going on, but this is kind of the talk back portion, if you can say it that way, of this time that all of us have heard now 7 days in the trial that we've listened. We now get to write down questions and to get specific answers if we haven't got a specific answer yet for an issue. So that's today, and all of this starts again 1 o'clock Eastern time tomorrow, noon center of the world, Oklahoma tomorrow. And if you've got additional thoughts or questions or insight on that, feel free to be able to contact our office. You can obviously do that, as lots and lots of people have called our office, given their opinions and thoughts about the impeachment over the last several days. You can find all the contact information at lankford.senate.gov. Go to the social media sites at Senator Lankford to be able to interact with us on social media there, or feel free to be able to call, email through our website, whatever it may be. This is, I was talking to one of my Democrat colleagues, I'll leave the name out, and he and I visited late last night when everything wrapped up. Actually, between when we finished and then when I came into the Facebook Live last night, he and I were chatting for a little while. And his comment to me was interesting. He said, when this is all over, how do we help pull the nation back together? We are so incredibly divided. Everyone is so incredibly angry. And it's like no one wants to see the other point of view. And it's been a privilege to be able to sit in the impeachment time period that I've heard every minute of every part of the dialogue. I have extensive notes. I took lots of questions and wrote them down in the first 3 days and then start checking those off when those questions are answered in the next 3 days. Then I've got questions that are still coming up. So I've had the opportunity to be able to sit in here both sides of the argument. Most people have not. Many people are just getting bits and pieces from news stories, but haven't had the opportunity to be able to see it all. It's so divisive. There'll have to be some dialogue among folks to say, hey, here's who we are as Americans. And regardless of which way this goes, at the end of it, we're still neighbors and we're still Americans together. We're still family together. And so we have to find a way to be able to still be able to cooperate on big, important things that are still going on in the country and big, important things in our own families and our own lives. So I look forward to that ongoing dialogue in the days ahead with my Democratic colleagues here and with all of us, all 4 million of us back home in Oklahoma as well. So take care, God bless, and let us know what questions and thoughts you have.